This is Criminal Interrupted. In the winter of 1987, in the quiet rural stretch of Polk County, Arkansas, a man named Ronald Gene Simmons committed one of the most devastating crimes in American history. Over the course of 3 days, he murdered 16 people, 14 of them being his own family. It was a crime so calculated, so intimate, and so incomprehensible that even today, decades later, investigators, psychologists, and surviving relatives still struggle with the same question: why? This is not a story of sudden rage. It is not a crime of passion. It is the story of a man who spent years constructing a world of absolute control, isolating his family, manipulating them, breaking them down piece by piece, until the moment he feared losing that control. And when that moment came, he chose annihilation over abandonment. In this episode, we're going to walk through the life of Ronald Gene Simmons. If you enjoyed these episodes, I encourage you to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favorite podcast app. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois, the second child of Loretta and William Simmons. His sister, Nancy Ellen, arrived 2 years later, but whatever stability the family had was short-lived. When Ronald was just 2 years old, his father died suddenly of a stroke. Within a year, Loretta remarried. Her new husband, William D. Griffin, worked as a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and his job meant constant relocation. The family moved repeatedly across central Arkansas, spending time in Polk County near the small town of Hector. These early years were marked by upheaval, but also by the first signs of something deeply troubling in Ronald's behavior. By age 10, Simmons had already developed a reputation within the family as a bully. He tormented his younger sister, Nancy, and his half-brother, Pete. Pete would later say that the same cruelty he experienced as a child resurfaced decades later in the same way Simmons treated his own children. Relatives described him as someone who zeroed in on the vulnerabilities of others and exploited them relentlessly. He was also known to be violent towards animals, striking the family cat until it became aggressive. Family members painted a consistent picture. Ronald was egocentric, quick to anger, and always ready to blame others. His parents tried to intervene, sending him to stay with family friends during summers and enrolling him in the Morris School for Boys, a Catholic boarding school near Searcy, but nothing changed. The volatility stayed with him. At 17, Simmons dropped out of school and enlisted in the Navy. It was during this period, not because of the military, but because of a chance meeting at a USO dance, that he met the person who would become central to his life, Bersabe Rebecca Becky Ulibari. They married in 1960 and, over the next 18 years, welcomed 7 children. Those children, Sheila, William, also known as Billy, Ronald Jr., Loretta, Eddie, Mary Ann, and little Becky, were described by friends and teachers as bright, polite, and painfully shy. They were talented in school, but guarded. They rarely talked about home. Some classmates remembered that the kids seemed happiest when their father was away, and that they often found small ways to escape the tension inside the house, playing outside, visiting friends, or simply staying at school as long as they could. Simmons continued serving in the military through the 1960s and 70s, but while his service record looked clean on paper, the real story was unfolding at home. The same controlling tendencies he showed as a child hardened into something far more suffocating as he became a husband and father. People who knew the family say the shift was gradual. Becky confided in her sister that Simmons' mother had warned her early on about his temper and his need to dominate. Quote, "She was always trying to tell me what Gene was like, but I didn't listen," end quote. Under Simmons' control, Becky's world shrank. He dictated how she dressed. Long dresses, no makeup, hair tied back. He handled all the household tasks, not out of helpfulness, but control. He forbade her from getting a driver's license. He refused to let her use a phone. Even her letters to family were monitored. At first, she was allowed to write, but eventually Simmons denied her stamps, forcing her to rely on others to secretly mail her correspondence. He used distant post office boxes to intercept and censor the family's mail. Her sister later said, quote, "Becky was not stupid by any means, but she was insecure. Ronald had made her believe that things were her fault, that she deserved what she got. He cut her off from all of us. He wouldn't let her have a telephone, and he'd stand there if she ever made any calls from somewhere else." End quote. The children felt the weight of that control too. They were obedient, quiet, and careful. Friends remembered that they had hideouts on their property, places they would retreat to when their father was home. They loved school because it was the one place where they could breathe. Loretta, especially, dreamed of leaving home the moment she turned 18. Sheila, the eldest, carried the heaviest burden of all. By the mid-1970s, the family had moved to a remote 2-acre property in Wills Canyon near Cloudcroft, New Mexico. The setting was beautiful. Pine trees, mountain air, quiet roads. But for the Simmons family, it became another layer of isolation. Neighbors were far away, visitors were rare, and Simmons' control tightened even further. He worked at a small Air Force observatory in the Sacramento Mountains, a secluded post with only a handful of personnel. As the facility downsized, Simmons became the last person assigned there, spending long stretches alone. When he retired from the Air Force in 1979, he returned to Holloman Air Force Base as a civilian employee, but the real story remained inside the home. Behind the facade of a stable military man was a husband who controlled every aspect of his wife's life, and a father whose children learned early how to stay small, quiet, and unnoticed. They were good kids, shy, smart, polite, and deeply bonded to one another. They found joy in each other, in school, in rare moments when their father wasn't home. But the world Simmons built around them was shrinking, and the warning signs that had been present since his childhood were growing darker. The seeds of what would come later were already there, buried beneath the surface, waiting. By 1981, the tightly controlled world inside the Simmons home began to fracture. On April 19, 1981, New Mexico Social Services received an anonymous call alleging that 17-year-old Sheila Simmons was pregnant, and that the father was her own father, Ronald Gene Simmons. The caller phoned 2 more times over the next 3 days. Years later, District Attorney Stephen Sanders revealed that the anonymous informant was Simmons' eldest son, Ronald Gene, Little Gene, Simmons Jr. He had reached a breaking point and was trying, in the only way he felt safe, to alert authorities. Social workers soon learned that Sheila's friends and school officials had also heard disturbing rumors. On April 20th, a caseworker travelled to the Simmons home in Cloudcroft. In a private conversation, Sheila confirmed the truth. She was pregnant and her father was responsible. The next day, prosecutors were notified. Under threat of criminal charges, Simmons agreed to place the entire family in psychological counselling. Investigators later pieced together the timeline. The first incident of incest occurred in July 1980 during a trip to Phoenix. Simmons and Sheila had travelled together for a coin show, a hobby he loved and she pretended to enjoy to please him. Social workers determined that at least 2 more assaults occurred in September 1980. By March 1981, Sheila realized she was pregnant. She told her father, and on June 17, 1981, she gave birth to a daughter, Sylvia. A New Mexico Social Services report dated June 8, 1981, shows that caseworkers attempted to obtain legal custody of Simmons' 4 daughters. They were alarmed that Simmons insisted the family would raise the baby he had fathered with Sheila. The report asked D.A. Sanders to seek a court order, but Sanders later said the request was never passed on to him by an assistant prosecutor. The family attended counseling for 5 weeks. Then, abruptly, in June, they stopped. Their attorney had warned Simmons that anything he said in therapy could be used against him. Once counseling ended, the criminal investigation resumed. On June 19th, the case was formally referred to the sheriff's office. Deputy Jeff Farmer visited the Simmons property on June 20th, 1981. He met with Sheila and Becky, but Sheila refused to give a statement. Becky deferred to her husband. On July 6, Farmer interviewed Everett Bannister, the principal of Cloudcroft High School and a neighbour. Bannister said he had delivered schoolwork to Sheila at home so she could graduate. He described Becky and the children as polite and friendly, but said Simmons himself was strange. He recalled seeing Simmons and Sheila riding together in a way that made him uneasy. Quote, "She was sitting so close to him, like boyfriend-girlfriend instead of father-daughter," end quote. Other locals had also noticed the same thing. Farmer's investigation ended on July 11th after he met with Simmons. Little Gene refused to discuss the allegations, saying his mother and sister had asked him not to. Farmer reported that the family claimed to be well satisfied with their counseling. But the case didn't disappear. Sheila ignored a grand jury subpoena until D.A. Sanders threatened her with contempt. And on August 10th, she finally testified. She told jurors that her father had sexual relations with her 3 times. Sanders later said, quote, "She broke down and cried. She said she didn't want her father to go to prison," end quote. Her testimony led to a criminal charge and an arrest warrant. On August 11th, 1981, just 2 months after giving birth, Simmons was formally charged with New Mexico's 12th Judicial District with 3 counts of incest. He faced up to 9 years in prison. Sheriff deputies drove to the Simmons home, a remote property 20 miles outside of Cloudcroft, to arrest him. But the house was empty. The family had packed up and vanished. Abe DeLeon, manager for New Mexico Human Services, later said he received an anonymous tip that the family had gone to Little Rock, Arkansas area. On March 17, 1982, he sent a protective service alert to Arkansas authorities. But Arkansas Human Services Deputy Director Walt Patterson said his agency couldn't act on an out-of-state alert alone. Proper procedure would have been for law enforcement to track Simmons through his military pension, which continued to be paid. Former D.A. Sanders said he met with Little Gene in mid-1982. The son claimed he didn't know where his father was living, but said he could have him returned to New Mexico if the charges were dropped. So, on August 10, 1982, the incest charges were conditionally dismissed. Officials had been unable to locate the family, and Sheila, the only witness, was no longer cooperating. The dismissal included a provision allowing reinstatement if Simmons was ever arrested, but it also cancelled the arrest warrant and removed the case from the FBI's National Crime Information Center. With that, the trail went cold. There was no longer any official record pointing to Simmons. When Simmons fled New Mexico, he wasn't simply avoiding arrest. He was protecting the world he had built. The incest investigation had pierced the secrecy and control he relied on. If authorities pushed further, the entire structure of dominance he maintained over his family would collapse. So he did what he always did when threatened. He tightened his grip, he gathered his family, he packed their belongings, and he disappeared across state lines, determined to rebuild his control somewhere no one else was looking. The Simmons family's first stop was Ward, Arkansas. On September 30th, 1981, Simmons found temporary work as a filing clerk in the Medical Records Division of the John L. McLennan Memorial Veterans Hospital in North Little Rock. It was a low-profile job, the kind of position that allowed him to blend in and avoid attention. But the move didn't bring the family closer together. In fact, it marked the beginning of their final unraveling. Gene Jr., the eldest son, refused to relocate. He stayed behind in New Mexico with his high school friends, distancing himself from the chaos that had consumed the family. Becky, still reeling from the incest allegations, stopped sharing a bed with her husband. The emotional fracture between them was widening, but Simmons' control over the household remained absolute. On January 10, 1982, Simmons left the hospital job for a permanent position as a personnel clerk with the 5th Army Medical Recruiting Battalion in Little Rock. But even as he settled into this new role, the dysfunction inside the family deepened. While living in Ward, Simmons impregnated Sheila a second time. This pregnancy did not continue as Sheila got an abortion. The family was living in a pressure cooker, isolated, fearful, and under Simmons' complete control. When the Simmons family arrived in Pope County in June of 1983, it wasn't by accident or convenience. On June 12th, Ronald Gene Simmons purchased 14 acres of remote land tucked 6.5 miles north of Dover, a place one observer later described as, quote, a farm too far from Little Rock to commute, end quote. And that was exactly what Simmons wanted. Not access, not community, isolation. The family called the property Mockingbird Hill, a name that suggested charm and birdsong, though the reality was far bleaker. Within 48 hours of moving in, Simmons hammered a no trespassing sign into the ground at the bottom of the road. A barbed wire fence soon followed. The message was unmistakable: stay away. The home itself was a patched-together structure, a 5-bedroom mobile home with 2 additional bedrooms built under an extended roof. The family room was the only spacious area, warmed by a wood-burning stove. Everywhere else felt cramped. The heating and air conditioning system didn't work. Only one room had a window unit. A phone line existed, but Simmons refused to have it connected. He didn't want the family to have any contact he couldn't control. The toilet was broken, so the family relied on 2 outhouses. Around the home, Simmons constructed a makeshift privacy fence, 10 feet tall in places, turning the property into a fortress. Several weeks before Christmas, he ordered the family to dig a new privy pit. They didn't know it then, but that pit would later become a grave. Mockingbird Hill wasn't a home. It was a sealed world, designed to keep the family in and everyone else out. The property sat a quarter-mile east of Arkansas Highway 7, perched on a low ridge parallel to Broomfield Road. The nearest community, Pleasant Grove, offered little more than a church, a cemetery, a corner store, and a campground. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, and where a family could disappear in plain sight. Inside the home, Simmons' behavior grew even more withdrawn. He spent most of his time locked in his bedroom. According to Becky's sister, Edith, quote, no one was allowed in his bedroom, not even Becky. He locked the door when he was in it. He locked the door when he was gone, end quote. The room was dark, foul-smelling, and off-limits. The only room in the house with an inside lock. Neighbours and acquaintances described Simmons as a reclusive loner, a stingy man with a cold, piercing stare. He forced his children into heavy labour, including hauling 5-gallon buckets of dirt to maintain the steep driveway. Loretta, then 17, confided to a classmate that her father was a drunken bum. The classmate, who occasionally stayed overnight, remembered Simmons always having a beer in his hand and spending nearly all of his time shut away in that locked room. Meanwhile, the children were growing older, and as they reached adulthood, one by one, they began to leave. Each departure tipped away at the tight, controlled world Simmons had spent years constructing, and for a man like him, that loss of control was intolerable. As the Simmons family settled into their new life at Mockingbird Hill, it became increasingly clear that the move to Polk County wasn't just about isolation. Friends and relatives believed there was another motive simmering beneath the surface. Sheila was slipping out of her father's control. By early 1983, Sheila was no longer the quiet, obedient girl Simmons had kept under his thumb for years. She was a young woman trying to build a future of her own. Simmons had enrolled her at the Drayton School of Business in Little Rock, conveniently located just blocks from his recruiting office. But instead of keeping her close, the school gave Sheila her first real taste of independence. It was there, at the school snack bar, that she met Dennis McNulty. He was studying radio communications, and she was taking secretarial courses, hoping to gain the skills she needed to support herself and her daughter Sylvia. Their connection was immediate. Their relationship grew quickly, and Simmons noticed. When the family uprooted and moved to Polk County, Dennis didn't fade into the background. He refused to let distance, or Simmons, push Sheila out of his life. He drove 150 miles round trip to see her week after week. For the first time, Sheila had someone who wasn't afraid of her father, someone who wasn't controlled by him, someone who loved her. And for Simmons, that was intolerable. By the mid-1980s, the once crowded Simmons household had dwindled to just 6 people. One by one, the older children had begun to escape the orbit of their father's control. Gene Jr., known as Little Gene, had already moved out before the family left New Mexico. He married Wilma Sue Pitts in Alamogordo on February 28, 1984. Sheila married Dennis on August 11, 1984, and moved to Camden, taking her daughter Sylvia with her. It was a step toward freedom that Simmons resented deeply. William Billy left next, after securing full-time hours at Hardee's in Russellville, where he became a shift manager. He then married Renata May in October 1985 and moved to Fordyce. That left Loretta, the 4th oldest, still at home. She was an honor student in a senior class at Dover High School, set to graduate in the spring. She made no secret of a desire to leave home the moment she turned 18. The children were growing up, they were building lives, and they were slipping away. And yet, despite the distance, they remained connected to their mother. Even as her marriage deteriorated and Simmons' control tightened, Becky held on to the one thing that still brought her joy, her children. She sent Christmas cards to her siblings every year, each one containing a handwritten letter. In the winter of 1987, she wrote with a rare sense of excitement. Her sister, Edith, remembered it vividly, quote, "She was very happy. Her whole family was coming to see her," end quote. For the first time in years, Becky believed she would have all her children and grandchildren together under one roof for Christmas. A moment of warmth, a moment of reunion, and a moment of hope. She had no way of knowing it would be the last Christmas they would ever share. In December 1987, the family began gathering at Mockingbird Hill. Gene Jr., now reconciling with his estranged wife Wilma, brought their 3-year-old daughter Barbara to stay with his parents until he and Wilma could afford a new place. They planned to reunite and remarry in February 1988. Gene Jr. arrived at Mockingbird Hill on December 21st. Wilma stayed behind in New Mexico for Christmas. She couldn't afford the trip. Inside the home, Simmons' isolation deepened. He had quit his weekend night shift at the Sinclair Mini Mart on December 18, 1987, ending a job he'd held for 3.5 years. Before that, he'd worked a string of low-paying jobs, an industrial cleaner at a pickle plant in Atkins, a processor at a frozen food plant in Russellville, and from January 1985 to November 19, 1986, a clerk at Woodline Motor Freight. His performance there had been so poor that he quit under pressure. 2 of his co-workers, Joyce Butts, his supervisor, and Kathy Kendrick, a woman who had reportedly rejected his advances, would later become victims of his rage. By late December, Simmons was unemployed, isolated, and spiraling. The privacy fence around the home loomed like a barricade. The privy pit the family had dug weeks earlier sat waiting, and inside the locked bedroom, Simmons kept 3 weapons: a long-barreled Ruger .22 caliber revolver he'd purchased in 1968, a Winchester .243 caliber rifle still in its box, and a snub-nosed Harrington and Richardson revolver he bought at a Walmart in Russellville on May 5, 1984. These were the weapons he would carry into the final, violent chapter of his life. The murders committed by Ronald Gene Simmons unfolded in 3 distinct phases, 2 at his isolated home near Dover, Arkansas, and the 3rd in the town of Russellville. Together, they form one of the most devastating family annihilations in American history. What makes this case even more chilling is the methodical planning behind it. Investigators later concluded that Simmons had spent weeks preparing for the moment when his entire family would be together for the Christmas holiday. He knew this would be the only time they would all gather in one place, and he intended to use that moment to end their lives. On the morning of December 22, 1987, Simmons began the first phase of his plan. Inside the family home, he attacked his wife Becky and his eldest son Gene. Both were bludgeoned and then shot with a .22 caliber pistol. Their deaths were swift and brutal. Moments later, he turned to his 3-year-old granddaughter Barbara and strangled her. He carried their bodies outside and dumped them into the pit his children had dug nearly 2 months earlier. Then he waited. He knew the rest of his children would be returning from school for Christmas break. Investigators believe that when Loretta, Eddie, Marianne, and Becky, ages 17, 14, 11, and 8, arrived home, Simmons separated them. One by one, he strangled each child. To ensure they were dead, he held their heads underwater in a large trash barrel he had placed in the non-functional bathroom and filled with water. The details are heartbreaking. All 4 children were still wearing their school clothes. Eddie had a lunch ticket in his pocket. The girls still had barrettes in their hair. One had gum in her mouth. Autopsy reports suggest that Loretta may have fought back. She had cuts on her face consistent with being punched, and her watch and one earring was broken. After killing them, Simmons carried their bodies outside and placed them in the same pit as the others. With the immediate family gone, Simmons spent the next hours drinking heavily. He wandered through the house, punching holes in the sheetrock walls and ceiling, and then he waited again, this time for the rest of the family to arrive after Christmas. Around midday on December 26, the remaining family members arrived at the home. The first to die were his son Billy and Billy's wife Renata. Simmons shot them both. He then turned to the 20-month-old son Trey, strangling and drowning the toddler. Next came his oldest daughter, Sheila, and her husband, Dennis McNulty. Both were shot and killed. Simmons then strangled Sheila and his 7-year-old daughter, Sylvia, and then her 20-month-old son, Michael. Inside the home, Simmons arranged the bodies of his family in neat rows in the lounge. He covered them with coats, except for Sheila, whose body he covered with Becky's best tablecloth. The bodies of the 2 youngest children, Trey and Michael, were wrapped in plastic sheeting and placed in abandoned cars at the end of the lane. The older 6 relatives had been shot as many as 7 times each. After completing the murders, Simmons drove to a Sears store in Russellville to pick up Christmas gifts he had previously ordered for his family, gifts they would never open. That night, he went to drink at North 40, a private club in Russellville. After drinking, he returned home to the bodies of his family. On the morning of December 28th, the first Monday after Christmas, Simmons prepared for the final phase of his plan. He wrote a short letter, placed $250 inside, and addressed it to his mother-in-law, May Novak. The note read, quote, "Dear Ma, sometimes you reap many more times what you sow. This is just a little token of our appreciation. Keep it in remembrance of us. Love, Gene." End quote. He then armed himself with 2 .22 caliber revolvers and drove a car belonging to his son, Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., into Russellville. He had mapped out his route carefully. Along the way, he mailed the letter to his mother-in-law and 2 additional letters with identical wording and money to his 2 nieces. His first target was Peel, Eddy and Gibbons law firm on South Glenwood Avenue. Inside was Kathy Cribbins-Kendrick, a woman Simmons had once worked with at Woodline Motor Freight. He'd been infatuated with her, but she had rejected him. Simmons walked into the office and shot Kendrick 4 times in the head. She died shortly afterwards at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center. Someone in the office called police at approximately 10:17 a.m. Simmons then drove to an oil company office at 2601 West Main Street. His intended target was the owner, Russell "Rusty" Taylor, a former employer. Simmons shot Taylor in the right arm and left side of his chest, wounding him. He then shot and killed James David Chaffin, a firefighter and delivery driver who had just returned from a car fire. Chaffin had no connection to Simmons. He was just simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Simmons also fired at a clerk, who escaped by ducking behind boxes. When officers arrived, she provided a detailed description of Simmons and his vehicle. The second shooting was reported at 10:27 a.m. Next, Simmons drove 3.1 miles back through downtown to the Sinclair Mini Mart at 2400 East Main Street. Inside, he shot store owner David Zollier once in the forehead and employee Roberta Woolry once in the jaw. Woolry later testified that she recognized Simmons the moment he turned towards her. Sawyer recalled that Simmons was grinning when he fired the first shot. A customer who had been chatting with Sawyer ran behind showcases and began throwing 6 packs of soda at Simmons in a desperate attempt to stop him. Simmons' final target was the Woodline Motor Freight Company on Bernard Way, where he had once worked. Inside, he shot his former supervisor, Joyce Butts, in the head and chest. Butts survived but later required open-heart surgery to remove a bullet and was left partially paralyzed on her left side. Simmons then ordered another employee, Vicki Jackson, at gunpoint to call the police. He told her, quote, "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me," end quote. After a 45-minute rampage across Russellville, killing 2 people, wounding 4 others, and briefly holding a woman hostage, Ronald Gene Simmons calmly walked into the Woodline Motor Freight office, sat down, and waited. When police arrived, Russellville Police Chief Herb Johnson entered the building unarmed and alone. Simmons handed over his .22 caliber H&R model revolver without resistance. A second gun, a Ruger revolver, was found in a paper bag on a desk. Ballistics would later confirm that this Ruger was the weapon used to kill 5 of his relatives. As Johnson escorted him outside, he asked Simmons why he hadn't killed himself. Simmons replied that he was afraid he would make a mess of it and didn't want to end up a vegetable. Later, Simmons' attorney, John Harris, confirmed that Simmons had fully intended to die that day. He had planned to kill himself after the shootings, but claimed he couldn't follow through because he was having trouble killing people, whatever that means. Harris said Simmons expected to be shot by police or an armed employee at a law office. Despite earning a small arms marksmanship ribbon in the Air Force, Simmons told Harris he was not a hunter and was unfamiliar with guns. With Simmons in custody, the violence stopped, but the full scope of what he had done was still unknown. The next morning, Sheriff James Boland spoke to reporters about Simmons' behavior in jail. Quote, "He's done nothing in his cell other than lay in his bunk with his face to the wall," end quote. Simmons refused to speak. He refused to answer questions. He wouldn't nod, shake his head, or acknowledge anyone. He was a wall of silence. Circuit Court Judge John G. Patterson held a probable cause hearing, but Simmons remained mute. Patterson ordered him held without bond and appointed 2 local attorneys, John Harris and Robert E. Irwin, to represent him. Russellville Police Chief Johnson filed charges accusing Simmons of 2 counts of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted capital murder for the shootings. Simmons still refused to answer questions about his family. Witnesses in Russellville told Sheriff Boland that Simmons had a large family, but none of them had been seen. With the judge who handled search warrants out of town, Boland made a critical decision. An emergency search was justified. He later testified that when he asked Simmons about his family, Simmons' eyes filled with tears and his lips quivered. That reaction convinced Boland that immediate entry was necessary. Authorities travelled to the Simmons residence on Broomfield Road, 16 miles north of Russellville. The only exterior door, a sliding glass door, was barricaded from the inside with a broom handle. Shortly before 3 p.m., Boland entered through an unlocked window on the south side of the house. Deputy Ray Caldwell later said that the entry was made to determine whether anybody was alive. Inside, investigators found the bodies of William Billy Simmons II, Renata Simmons, Sheila McNulty, Dennis McNulty, and Sylvia McNulty. All were still wearing their coats, suggesting they had been killed immediately upon arrival. An investigator followed Caldwell with a video camera documenting each room. The last door they reached was Simmons' own bedroom. It was locked, so Sheriff Boland kicked it in. Inside, they found a stark contrast to the rest of the home. It was the only room with an air conditioner. Shelves were lined with books, and behind a curtain, Simmons had hidden imported beer and gourmet food. These were luxuries he kept for himself while his family lived in squalor. The electricity had also been shut off. Unopened Christmas presents sat under the tree, and more gifts were found hidden in closets. Boland believed the victims had been dead for several days. Authorities initially planned to search a large pond for additional bodies. Simmons' wife, 4 children ages 7 to 17, and 4 grandchildren were still missing. Before the pond search began, a deputy noticed freshly disturbed earth about 150 feet from the house. And on December 29th, investigators uncovered a mass grave. 3 feet 4 inches wide, 6 feet 2 inches long. The first body found 2 feet below the surface, and 7 bodies were recovered in total. Other searchers found the remaining children in 2 abandoned cars on the property. In total, 6 victims had been shot, 8 had been strangled with a cord, later identified as fist stringers. Inside the home, investigators found walls and ceilings punched in, as if struck repeatedly with a heavy metal tool. Sheriff Boland believed it was a wrecking bar, but Simmons later told his attorney he used a hammer. Sheriff Boland released the autopsy findings on December 31st. Those shot to death were Becky Simmons, 46, twice in the head; Jean Jr., 26, 4 times in the head, once in the abdomen; Sheila, 24, 6 times in the head; Dennis McNulty, 33, once in the head; William H. Simmons II, twice in the head; Renata Simmons, 5 times in the head, twice in the neck. 8 victims were strangled with a cord. All were minors. Barbara Sue Simmons, 3. Loretta Simmons, 17. Eddie Simmons, 14. Marianne Simmons, 11. Rebecca Becky Simmons, 8. Sylvia McNulty, 6. Michael McNulty, 1. And one more victim, William H. Trey Simmons, was age 1, was not strangled, he was drowned. The discoveries at the Simmons home stunned even seasoned investigators. 14 bodies, 2 separate killing episodes, a mass grave, children hidden in abandoned cars, and a father who had wiped out nearly his entire family. And through it all, Simmons remained silent, expressionless, uncooperative, unmoved. The investigation was only the beginning. Ahead lay the trials, the sentencing, and the final chapter of one of the most haunting cases in American criminal history. When investigators, prosecutors, and journalists tried to understand why Ronald Gene Simmons committed one of the worst family annihilations in American history, they ran into a wall. Despite the scale of the violence, despite the meticulous planning, despite the sheer number of victims, no definitive official analysis of Simmons' motives was ever produced. From the moment of his arrest, Simmons refused to cooperate. He offered no confession, no explanation, no insight into his thinking. After both trials, he waived his right to appeal, an extremely rare move in capital cases. His silence effectively shut down the avenues investigators typically rely on to understand a killer's motivations. The justice system, meanwhile, moved quickly. With overwhelming evidence and a defendant who refused to contest his conviction, there was little incentive to spend years probing his psychology. In less than 3 years, Simmons was arrested, tried twice, convicted twice, and executed. That rapid timeline left little room for deeper inquiry. Psychological evaluations were limited as well. Simmons underwent a competency assessment, but it focused solely on whether he understood the charges and could participate in his defense. It was not designed to explore motive, trauma, personality disorders, or long-term behavioral patterns. And unlike many high-profile killers, Simmons left behind no manifesto, no diary, no letters explaining his worldview. The family members who might have shed light on his behavior were dead. Those who survived, extended relatives, neighbors, acquaintances, could only offer fragments. What remained was a tangle of possible motives: control, fear, rage, humiliation, financial collapse, and the looming threat of losing the family he had spent decades dominating. None of these threads were ever officially tied together, but when you look closely at the years leading up to the murders, a picture begins to emerge. To understand Simmons' motives, you have to understand the world he built inside his home, particularly during the years the family lived in New Mexico. There, Simmons exerted absolute control. His abuse was constant and escalating. It was mostly verbal, but at times physical. In 1978, he struck his wife Becky in front of their children for the first time. The children spent their after-school hours and weekends collecting rocks to build a stone wall around the property, a symbolic and literal barrier between them and the outside world. The eldest daughter, Sheila, endured the worst of it. She was sexually abused by her father, a trauma that would shape the rest of her short life. According to Simmons' attorney, John Harris, everything changed when the family fled New Mexico. Simmons believed he was a fugitive with a felony warrant hanging over him. What he didn't know was that New Mexico had stopped pursuing the case in 1982. But Simmons remained convinced that an active warrant existed. That belief fueled his paranoia and tightened his grip on the family. Financial struggles added to the pressure. Simmons was drowning in debt. He had quit his remaining part-time job. Becky had discovered a lump in her breast, which only deepened his anxiety. And looming over everything was the fear that Becky might leave him. According to Harris, Simmons believed that if she divorced him, his life would be over, especially with the incest allegations in his past. Schoolmates later recalled that Simmons kept a particularly tight rein on Becky and their 17-year-old daughter Loretta. All the children were talented students, but intensely shy. They avoided talking about their home life. According to a family acquaintance, Janet Mayhew, the children didn't like their father at all. They had hideouts on the property where they would retreat when he was home. Jennifer Mayhew remembered Becky saying the children would be happiest if Simmons worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Becky stayed with her husband out of fear. Her sister, Edith Nesby, said Becky felt trapped. She had small children, no job skills, and deep shame over the incest allegations. She didn't know how to leave. She didn't know where to go. Neighbors in Pleasant Grove were stunned when the truth came out. One longtime resident, Edna Baker, described the murders as, quote, the worst thing since the Civil War, end quote, to happen in the area. Others recalled seeing Simmons supervising his children as they gathered mud and stones to fill ruts in the driveway. By late 1987, the pressure inside the Simmons household had reached a breaking point. Polk County investigators suggested that Simmons may have been driven to rage by Becky's secret plans to leave him. In Russellville, witnesses also told authorities that Simmons held personal grudges against several of the people he later shot. He also had an unrequited infatuation with Kathy Kendrick, who had rejected his advances and filed a sexual harassment complaint against him. Meanwhile, the 3 older siblings, now adults living outside the home, were working together to convince Becky to leave. They saw the abuse, they saw the isolation, and they knew their mother was running out of time. Becky herself had begun to articulate her desperation. In a 4-page handwritten letter to her son William in the summer of 1987, she wrote, quote, "I am a prisoner here and the kids too. Dad has had me like a prisoner. I don't want to live the rest of my life with Dad." End quote. She wrote about longing for freedom, about wanting to go to church, to shop, to have a telephone, to see her children without fear. She worried she wouldn't be able to support the younger kids, but she was beginning to make plans. She even wrote that she wanted Loretta to move in with William and Renata once she turned 18. A friend of Loretta's later said that Loretta had told her that her mother was thinking about leaving with the children. The only thing stopping her was fear. Fear she couldn't support them, fear of Simmons' retaliation, and fear of the unknown. Becky had even talked about going to San Antonio, where her son, Gene Jr., was living. In another letter, dated September 29th, 1987, Becky wrote to Sheila, quote, "I've been doing a lot of thinking of leaving your dad. I've been a prisoner long enough. He has mistreated us all long enough. I don't want to continue this life with Fatso." End quote. She often referred to Simmons as Fatso in letters she didn't send through him, letters she hid, letters that revealed a woman suffocating under decades of control. Becky's family noticed the change in Simmons long before the murders. They said he seemed to grow stranger each year. Her older sister, Viola O'Shields, remembered him as a loving man once, someone who cared for his family. But that man was long gone. Manuel Ulibarri, Becky's brother, said Simmons had isolated his sister so completely that she couldn't go anywhere or do anything. The only time she left the house was to wash clothes. Manuel believed the motive was rooted in control. Quote, "He had just lost control of the family. Like a general, he had to have control all the time. After the incest, he lost control. My sister Becky was sleeping in the room with the girls. Gene just lost control of the family and couldn't take it." End quote. He also believed Simmons thought Gene Jr. was coming to take the family away, to rescue them, to bring them to San Antonio. And that fear, Manuel said, may have been the final trigger. When you put all the pieces together, a picture emerges. Not a simple motive, but a constellation of pressures. A lifetime of abusive control, the threat of exposure, the fear of abandonment, financial collapse, the belief he was a wanted fugitive, the growing independence of his children, Becky's plans to leave, the older siblings encouraging her, personal grudges in Russellville, rejection by Kathy Kendrick, and a deepening sense of humiliation and loss of power. Simmons' world was built on dominance, and by late 1987, that world was crumbling. His wife was planning to leave, his children were slipping away, and his authority was evaporating. And in his mind, the only way to regain control was to destroy everything. He never said this out loud, he never confessed, he never explained himself. But the evidence, the letters, the witness accounts, and the patterns of his life all point to a man who would rather annihilate his family than watch them escape him. In the end, Simmons' motive may never be fully known, but the story left behind, through the people who survived him, through the letters Becky wrote, through the fear etched into the memories of neighbors and friends, reveals a man driven by control, consumed by rage, and terrified of losing the power he had spent decades enforcing. In the months following his arrest, as the legal machinery moved swiftly towards trial and sentencing, Ronald Gene Simmons did something unexpected. He reached out, not to family, not to friends, not to clergy, but to the media. Specifically, to a local news anchor named Annie Jensen, a familiar face from KHTV. It began with a letter. No one knows exactly why he chose her or what he hoped to gain, but that first letter opened the door to a series of exchanges that would become one of the few windows into Simmons' state of mind after the murders. Over time, Simmons and Jensen exchanged 8 letters, and she conducted 4 in-person conversations with him. These weren't brief interviews or casual chats. Each conversation lasted 2 or 3 hours, and they took place in multiple locations. Twice at the Pope County Detention Center, once at the Tucker Unit, and once at the Cummins Unit, where Simmons would eventually be executed. From the beginning, Simmons insisted on confidentiality. He told Jansen that if he ever suspected she intended to use their conversations for journalistic purposes, he would stop speaking to her immediately. He wanted control, even in captivity, even in the shadow of death. Jansen later described their first meeting as unsettling. Simmons' paranoia was unmistakable. He believed that even ordinary objects, light bulbs, wall switches, anything unsecured, might conceal listening devices. He scanned the room constantly, hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, as though the walls themselves might be conspiring against him. This wasn't the paranoia of a man trying to evade justice. It was the paranoia of someone who had lived for decades in a world of his own making, a world where control was everything and surveillance, real or imagined, was always a threat. Simmons also communicated with another journalist, Laura Scholl, a reporter for the Russellville Courier-Democrat. At least one of their interactions took place inside his jail cell at the Polk County facility. But unlike his guarded, extended conversations with Jansen, Simmons' exchanges with Scholl were more limited. He never opened up to her in the same way. Perhaps he didn't trust her. Perhaps he didn't feel the same need to control the narrative. Or perhaps, by then, he had already said everything he intended to say. One of the lingering questions about Simmons' final days of freedom is whether he intended to survive the Russellville shootings at all. Many investigators, attorneys, and even Simmons himself suggested that he had planned to die that day. But the plan didn't unfold the way he expected. During the Russellville rampage, Simmons fired multiple shots from his .22 caliber pistols, shots that failed to kill several of his intended victims. Those failures shook him. If the gun couldn't reliably kill others, he feared it might not kill him either. The last thing he wanted to do was to botch a suicide attempt and end up alive but disabled. He also doubted his chances of dying in a shootout with police. Despite his military background, Simmons wasn't confident in his ability to provoke a fatal response. He had told his attorney, John Harris, that he wasn't a hunter and wasn't particularly familiar with guns. Even though he had earned a small arms marksmanship ribbon in the Air Force, he didn't trust himself or the situation to guarantee a clean death. So instead of forcing a confrontation, Simmons surrendered. He walked out of the Woodline Motor Freight office, handed his revolver to Police Chief Herb Johnson, and gave up without resistance. When Johnson later asked him why he hadn't killed himself, Simmons replied that he was afraid he would make a mess of it and end up a vegetable. It was a chillingly practical answer, not remorse, not fear of judgment, just a calculation. The question of whether Simmons intended to die that day is ultimately inseparable from the rest of his life. Control had always been his driving force. Control over his wife, his children, his home, his environment. When that control began to slip, he destroyed everything around him. In Russellville, he tried to control the ending too, but when the tools he relied on failed him, he chose surrender over uncertainty. And afterwards, in jail, he continued to exert control in the only ways left to him, by refusing to cooperate with investigators, by refusing to appeal his death sentence, by choosing which reporters he would speak to, and by dictating the terms of those conversations. Even in the letters he wrote to Ann Jansen, even in the hours he spent talking to her, Simmons never revealed a clear motive. He never expressed regret. He never offered any insight. And he never explained why he killed his family or why he targeted the people in Russellville. He simply maintained control of his silence, of his narrative, of the small, shrinking world he still commanded from behind bars. After the Russellville shootings and the discovery of 14 bodies at Mockingbird Hill, the legal system moved quickly. On December 30th, 1987, just 2 days after his arrest, Ronald Gene Simmons was transferred from the Polk County Detention Center to the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock. Circuit Judge John Patterson had ordered him held without a bond and undergo a psychiatric evaluation. Despite a backlog of admissions, Simmons was taken in immediately, an emergency placement at Rogers Hall, the wing reserved for the criminally insane. He arrived under heavy security due to the threats of his life. Dr. Roy Ragdale explained that hospital policy allowed early admission for anyone charged with a capital crime, and Simmons, facing multiple capital murder charges, certainly qualified. Simmons spent 60 days undergoing psychological testing. On February 29, 1988, State Hospital Director Dr. Roy Ragsdale announced the findings. Simmons was competent to stand trial and fully responsible for his actions at the time of the killings. He was diagnosed with a mixed personality disorder with narcissistic and paranoid features. With that, Simmons was returned to Polk County. Judge Patterson accepted the hospital's findings and set a trial date for May 9th. On March 7th, Patterson also ruled that Simmons was not indignant. Despite having no job, Simmons received a military pension of about $917 a month, enough, the judge said, to pay for his own defense. His attorneys had already accumulated a roughly $11,000 in fees and expenses. Prosecutor John Bynum objected the defense's request for county funds, noting that the indignant defense fund held only $15,278. Ultimately, everything of value Simmons owned went to his attorneys, including concrete blocks from the privacy wall at Mockingbird Hill and open Christmas gifts recovered from the crime scene. Simmons' first trial focused solely on the Russellville shootings. He was charged with murdering Kathy Kendrick and J.D. Chaffin, attempting to murder 5 others, and kidnapping a 6th person on December 28, 1987. On March 24, 1988, Simmons spoke in court for the first time since his arrest. He pleaded innocent to 4 capital murder charges, 5 counts of attempted capital murder, and 1 count of kidnapping. He ended his statement with, quote, "In the interest of justice, I request a speedy trial," end quote. At the same hearing, Judge Patterson granted the defense's request to move the trial to Franklin County due to extensive media coverage. From the beginning, Simmons wanted the death penalty. Under Arkansas law, a death sentence could only be imposed by a jury. If Simmons had pleaded guilty, the maximum penalty would have been life without parole. He refused that option. His trial began on May 9, 1988, in Ozark. The jury, 7 men and 5 women, were selected from a pool of 113 people. They were mostly older, white, working-class individuals with limited formal education. On the second day of trial, a juror was excused after allegedly making a derogatory remark about Simmons. Judge Patterson declined to declare a mistrial, citing the availability of alternates. Over 4 days, the prosecution called 30 witnesses. 17 testified on Tuesday, 13 on Wednesday. 9 identified Simmons as the gunman. 1 witness recalled Simmons saying he wanted to get even with certain people in town. Eyewitness accounts and ballistics evidence linked Simmons to shootings at 4 separate businesses. Despite sending subpoenas to 11 witnesses, the defense called none. They presented no evidence. They had already decided against an insanity defense. After the verdict, attorney Robert Irwin admitted, quote, "We didn't have any witnesses. We looked high and low," end quote. Prosecutor John Bynum argued forcefully for death, quote, "There is nothing in the record that says this man is entitled to a break. Nothing," end quote. The jury deliberated less than 90 minutes before finding Simmons guilty on all counts. After another 2 hours of deliberation, they sentenced him to death. He also received 30 years for each of the 4 attempted capital murder charges, 20 years for a 5th attempt capital murder charge, and 7 years for first-degree false imprisonment. After the jury was dismissed, Simmons asked to address the court. Speaking softly from the witness stand, he announced that he intended to waive all rights to appeal. Later that evening, jurors reflected on the decision. One said, quote, "It's something the jury was not proud of," end quote. Another said they had no problem with the verdict. Simmons then read a prepared statement, one of the few times he ever articulated his wishes publicly. Quote, "If the jury renders the most proper and just and wise sentence of death in this case, I want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. I want no action that will delay, deny, deter or denounce this very correct and proper death sentence. My attorneys have repeatedly counseled me to appeal. However, that is not what I want. I believe now and always have in the death penalty. To those who oppose the death penalty, I say, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment. Let the torture and suffering in me end. Please allow me the right to be at peace." End quote. After he finished, psychiatrist Dr. Lou Neal testified that Simmons was mentally competent to make this decision. Quote, "There is no way he is going to change his feelings on this." End quote. Simmons' attorneys confirmed that he had written the statement days earlier against their advice. Later that night, James Lee, spokesman for the Arkansas Attorney General's office, affirmed Simmons' right to waive his appeals. Quote, "Under Arkansas law, the appeal is not automatic. It is not mandatory." End quote. Simmons had made his choice. He wanted the death penalty, and he wanted it carried out quickly. And the legal system, rarely so swift, would ultimately grant him exactly what he asked for. In the days after his conviction, Ronald Gene Simmons did something he rarely did. He talked. On May 15th, in a 2-hour interview with a reporter from the Russellville Courier-Democrat, Simmons spoke openly about death, his own death. Quote, "Death is not to be feared. It is what comes before death that is to be feared." End quote. He told the reporter that he had no doubts that his death sentence was the correct punishment, though he admitted he wouldn't believe it until it actually happened. But when the questions turned toward the murders at his home, he shut down completely. He refused to discuss anything about what happened at Mockingbird Hill. Instead, he criticized the criminal justice system, claiming that, quote, "Those who need punishment don't get it." End quote. He described himself as an introvert and said he hadn't answered all the questions during a psychiatric evaluation at the state hospital. The next day, May 16th, Judge John Patterson ruled that Simmons was of sound mind and fully capable of waiving his right to appeal. Patterson then issued an order scheduling Simmons' execution by lethal injection for 11 a.m. on June 27th. Simmons didn't fight it. In fact, he embraced it, calling the sentence, quote, "proper punishment for the crime," end quote. He told the judge he would not attempt to stop the execution. Quote, "I arrived at my decision in regard to the proper punishment on December 28th, and don't hold your breath for me to change it," end quote. He told Patterson he had decided to seek execution on the very day of the Russellville shootings. Judge Patterson reminded him that he could change his mind at any time before the execution. Simmons repeated that his decision had been made on December 28th, and he would not be changing it. On May 18th, 1988, Simmons was moved from the Pope County Detention Center to the Arkansas Department of Corrections Maximum Security Unit in Jefferson County. Officers took him into custody and placed him in a death row cell. Meanwhile, the property where the murders occurred was tied up in a legal and financial fallout. In early January 1988, Dorothy Gula of Woodhaven, New York, filed a foreclosure suit against Simmons, seeking the return of the Broomfield Road property and the approximately $28,000 she said he still owed. The foreclosure was approved in May. No payments has been made ever since November 1987. On June 15th, the property was auctioned on the steps of the Pope County Courthouse. 3 television crews and 2 newspaper reporters covered the event. Only one bid was placed, from the same woman who had sold Simmons the property. The house didn't stand much longer. On March 29, 1989, after months of vandalism, it burned to the ground. The state fire marshal ruled it arson. No one rebuilt. The site faded quietly from public memory. After the Ozark trial, Simmons met several times with Roger and Viola O'Shields, Viola being Becky's sister. During one of those conversations, Simmons admitted he intended to kill himself after murdering his victims. When Roger asked why he didn't, Simmons replied, quote, "Do you know what kind of ammunition I was using? 22 caliber hollow points. They don't penetrate. They splatter. I did not want to shoot myself and become a vegetable." End quote. It was a chillingly practical explanation. While Simmons refused to appeal, others tried to intervene on his behalf. On June 6, Morganton attorney Mark Cambiano, representing a coalition of churches, and Reverend Lou Franz of Star City, asked the Arkansas Supreme Court to review Simmons' death sentence. He filed a petition arguing that death sentences should require mandatory appeals. On June 17th, after a 2-hour hearing in Ozark, Judge Patterson denied a petition to delay the execution. But 3 days later, on June 20th, the Arkansas Supreme Court issued a temporary stay in a 6-1 ruling. Cambiano, representing Catholic priest Lou Franz, had raised questions about whether Arkansas should require mandatory review in capital cases, or whether a defendant could legally waive appeals. Because of this stay, Judge Patterson postponed the upcoming trial for the murders of the Simmons family members, originally scheduling for July 18th. But the pause didn't last long. On July 1st, 1988, the Arkansas Supreme Court lifted the stay in a 5-2 ruling. The court held that Reverend Franz did not have standing and that Simmons fully understood his decision to waive appeals. They also ruled that Arkansas did not require automatic appeals in capital cases, though the court would not automatically accept a defendant's desire to decline them. With the stay lifted, Governor Bill Clinton issued a proclamation on July 15th, setting Simmons' execution date for August 9th. The exact time would be set by A.L. Art Lockhart, Director of Arkansas Department of Corrections. But the legal battle still wasn't over. On August 3rd, U.S. District Judge G. Thomas Isle issued another stay. He said he needed more time to determine whether federal law required mandatory review in death penalty cases. He would not consider whether others had standing to intervene, nor whether Simmons was competent to waive appeals. This stay came after Cambiano filed motions on August 2nd on behalf of Reverend Franz and Darrell Wayne Hill, another death row inmate. On August 12th, Cambiano filed yet another motion, this time asking that a temporary guardian be appointed for Simmons, arguing that his attorneys, John Harris and Robert Irwin, had provided ineffective assistance. Judge Patterson scheduled a tentative trial date for December, and Simmons was temporarily moved from death row to the Russellville jail on August 19th to make him more accessible for legal meetings. He was returned to death row on September 1st. On September 23rd, Judge Isle ruled that Reverend Franz and inmate Hill did not have standing to appeal Simmons' execution. Only Simmons himself could make further appeals. Isle also affirmed that Arkansas did not require mandatory appeals in capital cases. I also just realized I might be saying Judge Isle's name wrong, so I apologize for that. Just know when I say Isley from now on, I actually meant Isle. Then, on September 29th, Isley ordered additional psychiatric evaluations for Simmons and appointed Little Rock attorney John Wesley Horn Jr. to advise him on possible appeal options. Before making a final ruling, Isley requested a 30-day assessment at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Hall reviewed the case thoroughly and concluded that Simmons' attorneys had made all appropriate arguments and objections, and that all appeal issues had been addressed. Finally, on December 29th, Judge Isley issued an order confirming that Simmons could legally waive his right to appeal his conviction. The path was now clear. Simmons had fought for death from the beginning, and the courts had ultimately agreed to let him have it. By the end of 1988, the legal system had already convicted Ronald Gene Simmons for the Russellville shootings, but the far larger case, the murders of his own family, still awaited trial. Given the overwhelming publicity surrounding the case, Judge John Patterson issued an order on December 21, 1988, moving the trial to Clarksville in Johnson County. The 14 deaths were consolidated into one count of capital murder, a decision that reflected both the scale of the crime and the logistical challenges of trying each killing separately. On January 18, 1989, an evidentiary hearing addressed whether the state could use evidence obtained when officers entered Simmons' home on December 27, 1987. Sheriff Jim Bolin and other officers testified that they entered the residence because they feared the family might still be alive, injured, bleeding, or in need of immediate help. Simmons had refused to answer questions about their whereabouts. When asked if he would consent to the search, he shook his head no, the lips quivering, his eyes watering. Sheriff Bolin told the court, quote, "I felt very deeply that his family might be in there, might be shot, and needing medical help. We couldn't find them. He wouldn't tell us where they were," end quote. He added that the first thing officers did upon entering was check each body for signs of life. Judge Patterson ruled that the entry was justified under emergency aid guidelines and allowed the evidence to stand. He also reaffirmed that the 14 deaths would be treated as a single count of capital murder. The trial began on February 6, 1989, with jury selection from a pool of 89 potential jurors. When Judge Patterson asked, "Is there anybody who has not heard anything about this case?" not a single hand went up. Extra security filled the courthouse. State troopers inside the building and stationed in the courtroom. By late Tuesday, a jury of 4 women and 8 men had been seated. The defense exhausted its peremptory challenges, selecting the final 2 jurors. Opening arguments began Wednesday in a packed courtroom of about 100 spectators. Prosecutor John Bynum announced that the state would introduce a note found in Simmons' safe deposit box at People's Bank in Russellville. He told the jury the note would shed light on Simmons' motive, specifically his volatile, love-hate relationship with his eldest daughter Sheila, with whom he had fathered a child. A dozen relatives of the victims sat silently in the front rows. On February 9th, Dr. Bennett G. Preston, former assistant medical examiner for Arkansas, summarized his autopsy findings of the 14 bodies. Other testimony confirmed that no firearms were found inside the Simmons home. A family friend testified that Becky Simmons had been saving money to divorce her husband at the time of the killings, a detail that aligned with the letter she'd written in the months before her death. On the morning of February 10th, a state firearms and tool marks examiner testified the bullets recovered from the 5 victims matched the gun Simmons had with him when he was arrested. Bullet fragments from a 6th victim could not be conclusively identified. Just before noon, during a routine sidebar conference between judge and the attorneys, the trial took a shocking turn. Without warning, Simmons lunged between the lawyers and punched prosecutor John Bynum in the chin, sending spectators screaming and ducking beneath benches. He swung again, missed, and reached for bailiff's holstered gun before officers swarmed him and dragged him out the side door. Jurors stared wide-eyed. Some relatives of the slain family dove to the floor. Charlotte Croston, whose daughter and son-in-law were among the victims, said, quote, "I'm glad he showed the jury. I'm glad they got to see what he's really like," end quote. The attack came moments after Bynum introduced a letter Simmons had written to Sheila, expressing rage that she had revealed he was the father of her child. The letter ended with the chilling line, quote, "I will see you in hell," end quote. Judge Patterson immediately removed the jurors and declared a recess. He instructed them to disregard the incident, reminding them that the trial had already gone on for 5 days and needed to continue. Later, Simmons' attorney asked why he had sucker punched the prosecutor. Simmons replied, quote, "I am in control. I am in control," end quote. Attorney John Harris believed the attack was deliberate, an attempt to sabotage any defense strategy and ensure a death sentence. In a later off-the-record conversation with news anchor Ann Jensen, Simmons smirked when she asked about the punch. He told her it was an, quote, MNM, mitigation neutralizing maneuver, end quote. He wanted the jury's final impression of him to be violent, guaranteeing they would choose death. After the recess, Lieutenant Jay Winters read aloud the letter Simmons had written to Sheila McNulty, quote, "I told you that your lack of communication with me was going to be your downfall. You've destroyed me. You want me out of your life. I will be out of your life. I will see you in hell," end quote. The courtroom was silent, and the words echoed through the room. The prosecution called 18 witnesses. The defense called none. Before Simmons' attack on Bynum, they had planned to call ballistics expert, a police dispatcher, and Vicky Jackson, the Woodline Freight employee Simmons had ordered to call police during the Russellville shootings. After the attack, the defense abandoned the plan entirely. Handcuffed from his earlier outburst, Simmons showed no emotion when the jury returned its verdict at 8:30 p.m. on February 10th. After more than 4 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty. At 11:08 p.m., they returned with a sentence: death by lethal injection. Relatives of the victims clapped quietly when the verdict was announced. But when the sentence was read, the courtroom fell silent. On February 11th, Simmons told Judge Patterson he knew of no reason he should not be immediately sentenced. Patterson set the execution date for March 16th. Simmons refused to appeal. He repeated the same line he had used before, quote, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment," end quote. The court held a hearing to determine whether he was competent to waive further proceedings. They concluded he was. On March 1st, 1989, Judge Patterson formally allowed Simmons to waive his appeal. After the hearing, Simmons spoke to reporters. a rare move. He refused to discuss the crimes or his desire for death, but he lashed out at those who had tried to block his first execution date. Quote, "Perhaps you folks can suggest to Scum Cambiano and Joker Franz that as they crawl through their self-centered cesspool, maybe they ought to keep an eye over their shoulder. Someone might just want to put their lights out." End quote. On March 10th, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled Simmons competent to waive his appeal. 3 days later, they rejected a petition from another death row inmate, Jonas Whitmore. Whitmore was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which delayed Simmons' execution on March 15th. On March 29th, the U.S. Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals issued another delay, allowing time to review Whitmore's petition and Judge Isley's rulings. On July 3rd, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear Whitmore's case in October. The situation was surreal. Both Simmons and Arkansas Attorney General Steve Clark wanted the execution to proceed, while outside parties fought to stop it. Simmons submitted a sworn statement, quote, "Do not appeal for me or try to help me. I willingly accept my punishment." End quote. After a 13-month pause, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling on April 24, 1990, in Whitmore v. Arkansas. Whitmore had no standing to intervene. The ruling left one thing clear. The only person who could stop Simmons' execution was Simmons himself, and he had no intention of doing so. On May 31, 1990, Governor Bill Clinton signed a new death warrant, setting the execution for June 25, 1990, nearly 2 years after the original date. There was no more obstacles. The end was finally in sight, though whether it would bring relief or simply more questions remained to be seen. By the time Ronald Gene Simmons reached the end of his legal road, he had become an anomaly on death row. While other inmates fought their sentences, filed appeals, and clung to any chance of survival, Simmons did the opposite. He embraced his execution. He wanted it, and that desire unsettled the men housed alongside him. Simmons was kept alone on death row. Other prisoners resented him, not because of his crimes, but because he refused to fight his death sentence. They believed his cooperation with the state weakened their own cases, making it harder for them to argue against their executions. In June, Assistant Attorney General Jack Gillian explained Simmons' unusual status. He said Simmons could stop the execution at any moment, right up until the lethal injection began, simply by saying he wanted to pursue an appeal. Quote, "He is a volunteer," end quote. On June 25, 1990, Simmons gave a brief, cryptic final statement. Quote, "Justice delayed, finally be done, is justifiable homicide," end quote. One of his attorneys, John Harris, later said he believed Simmons accepted his punishment, but felt it had been delayed too long. Simmons had been ready to die since the day of the Russellville shootings. 14 people gathered in the witness room that night. 2 were reporters, Bob Simmons of the Associated Press and Scott Bowles of the Arkansas Gazette. The room was dark, quiet, tense. At 9 p.m., without warning, the curtains to the execution chamber snapped open. Bright fluorescent light flooded the witness room. Simmons lay strapped to a gurney, about 8 feet from the first row of observers. His head was positioned to the left, his feet to the right. 2 IV bags hung above him. He stared straight up into the lights, blinking rapidly. He was covered from chin to toe in a white sheet. His arms were exposed and strapped tightly to his sides. Catheters were inserted into both arms. One witness whispered to himself, quote, "He's not a very big man, is he?" End quote. At 9:02 p.m., Warden Willis Sargent announced that the execution would begin. Simmons continued blinking, his head immobilized by a leather strap across his brow. He tried to glance upward toward the executioner's room. Then he turned his eyes once to the right, towards the witnesses, before returning his gaze to the ceiling. At 9:06, Simmons suddenly called out, "Oh, oh," and began coughing. His eyes closed, his body slackened, as though drifting into sleep. But the coughing continued. His stomach rose beneath the sheet as convulsions shook the gurney. For the next 4 minutes, Simmons' body convulsed intermittently. The movements grew weaker as his fingers and face began turning purple. By 9:10, he was still. At 9:15, Prison Medical Administrator Bias checked the catheter in Simmons' right arm. At 9:17, he placed a stethoscope on Simmons' chest, checked his wrist, then touched his neck. At 9:18, the Lincoln County coroner entered the chamber. At 9:19 p.m., he pronounced Ronald Gene Simmons dead. Simmons died by lethal injection at the Cummins unit, the method he had chosen. His execution marked several firsts for Arkansas. The first execution by lethal injection in state history. The first time an inmate waived all rights to appeal. Only the second execution since Arkansas resumed capital punishment after a 26 moratorium, occurring just 1 week after the previous execution. 2 hours before he died, prison officials asked Simmons what he wanted done with his remains. He replied simply, quote, "No comment," end quote. With no relatives willing to claim his body and no burial instructions, Simmons was interred in Lincoln Memorial Lawn Cemetery near the Varna unit in Lincoln County. The details of the burial were kept secret until 20 minutes before the service. His sister, Nancy Madden, and several members attended the graveside ceremony. Simmons never expressed remorse, not once. He never apologized, never explained, never offered insight into the murders of his family or the shootings in Russellville. He repeatedly sought execution, telling attorneys and reporters that death was the only way to end his suffering, but he shared almost nothing with authorities. Acquaintances believed his silence was intentional, a final act of control, even in death. By refusing to explain himself, he ensured that no one else could define his story. A CBS Evening News report from September 29, 1987, captured the central mystery. Sheriff James Boland voiced the question that haunted investigators, prosecutors, and the public. Why? After the execution, that question remained unanswered. In mid-August 1990, Judge Patterson authorized the destruction of 3 videotapes documenting the murder scenes at the Simmons property. Sheriff Boland carried out the order personally. Quote, "I did what I've wanted to do ever since Simmons was executed, destroy the tapes. I've had calls from all over the country, even before he was executed, from people wanting the videotapes. The calls have been heavy since the execution." End quote. The tape showed the condition of all 14 bodies. 4 adults and 1 child found inside the house, 7 bodies recovered from the shallow grave, 2 children wrapped in trash bags in a car trunk. Portions of the footage had been shown to jurors during Simmons' trial. None of it would ever be seen again. Simmons' 2 pistols were auctioned for a total of $2,925. 1 gun, never used in the murders, sold to a Pottsville resident for $1,325, purchased as a macabre souvenir. The second weapon, the gun Simmons used to kill 8 people, was bought by his own attorney, John C. Harris. Harris said he believed the bids were too low and purchased the gun himself. More than 100 people and a dozen journalists attended the auction, many drawn by the spectacle. Only 13 people actually placed bids, and nearly all the bidding came from just 4 men. In the end, Simmons left behind no confession, no explanation, and definitely no remorse. He took the truth with him. His silence became part of the story, a void that investigators, journalists, and surviving relatives have tried to fill for decades. He died exactly the way he wanted, quickly, without appeals, and without delay. But the question Sheriff Boland asked, the question everyone asks, remains. Why? And that question, even after the execution, was never answered. Before we end this episode, I want to take a moment to shift the focus away from the man who caused so much devastation and towards the people whose lives were stolen. Their names deserve to be spoken, their stories deserve to be remembered, and their humanity deserves to stand above the violence that took them. These were sons and daughters, husbands and wives, babies who'd never had the chance to grow up, young people with dreams, parents who loved their children, families who should have been safe in their own home. Today we remember Bersabe Rebecca Becky Simmons, 46 years old, a mother who held her family together for as long as she could, a woman who longed for freedom, for peace, for a life beyond fear. Ronald Gene, Little Gene Simmons Jr., 26 years old, a son who tried to protect his siblings the only way he knew how. Barbara Sue Simmons, 3 years old, a little girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. Loretta Simmons, 17 years old, an honors student, bright and determined, ready to leave home and build a future of her own. Eddie Simmons, 14 years old, quiet, kind, and talented, a boy who deserved to grow into the man he might have become. Marianne Simmons, 11 years old, a child full of potential whose life was cut short far too soon. Rebecca Becky Simmons, 8 years old, a little girl who should have been playing, laughing, and dreaming. William Billy Simmons II, 22, and Renata Mae Simmons, 21, a young couple building a life together, excited for their future. William H. Trey Simmons III, 1 year old, a baby whose smile lit up the room. Sheila Simmons McNulty, 24 years old, a young woman who had survived more than most people ever knew. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal to the people she loved. Dennis McNulty, 33 years old, a steady, kind, and patient man, the kind of person who didn't scare easily, even when faced with the shadow of Sheila's past. Sylvia Gail McNulty, 6 years old, and Michael McNulty, 1 year old. 2 children who were deeply loved by their parents and should have grown up to see the future. And finally, Kathleen Kathy Kendrick, 24 years old, and James David Jim Chaffin, 33 years old. 2 innocent people caught in the path of violence they had no part in creating. These 16 lives were more than victims. They were people with stories, with families, with futures that should have unfolded differently. And while this case is remembered for its brutality, they deserve to be remembered for their humanity. Thank you for listening, and Merry Christmas to you all.